I'd like to extend a very, very warm welcome to delegates from across Wales, England and Scotland. Bore da, croeso cynnes I pawb bore yma sy'n gwrando mewn. Maen nhw'n gwrando mewn o Gymru, Lloegr a hefyd o'r Alban. Mae'r gweddill o Gweminar yma wedi cael cyfle trwy gyfrwng y Saesneg. So, good morning. Can I extend a very warm welcome to the new delegates who are listening in today. We've got about 80 people listening in across the UK. A large number of you are first-time webinar listeners in, so I thought I'd take a couple of minutes of my time just to share to you what you can expect today and how it's actually going to work. So my name's Ina Lloyd. I'm from the Good Practice team within the Wales Audit Office. I'll take you through a couple of steps in terms of the webinar, then I'll introduce the panel, and then we'll move on to the main body of the actual webinar. So, what is a webinar? It's really like a radio show, really, and you're listening in, but also you're contributing. The success of this webinar is down to the questions that you actually ask us. And can I say thank you to those who already sent questions in? Really appreciate them. In terms of questions, can I assure anyone who's thinking of sending a question in and is feeling, well, I'm not sure if I should be asking this question, I guarantee your anonymity. I don't mention that where you're from or which organisations you're from. Because if you're thinking of the question, I can assure you other people will be as well. So please ask the question, and it's far more important to get the response to that. So in terms of questions, there are two ways you can actually send questions in. Firstly, you can send a question in through the question box that's on your webinar drop-down box. We'll move to a slide now that will show you where that actually is. Another option, if you can't find that, because a few people don't seem to have this question box for some reason, is that you can send a question in by email. Our email address is good.practice@audit.wales. Finally, for those of you who are tweeting today, and we would genuinely encourage you to tweet as well, we have a hashtag that we're using, and the hashtag is WAO fraud. So those are three ways you can actually send questions in. In terms of following this event, we record the webinar and we edit it into five very easy listening podcasts. They take a few days to edit, so I would say today's Tuesday. I can say probably by Monday of next week. I'm looking at the editor as I'm speaking now, and he thinks Monday. He's given me the thumbs up. Monday of next week, the podcast will be available, and we'll send you an email just to let you know it's ready for you to download. We share information through a variety of ways, so let's go quickly through the information. We share it through our Good Practice Exchange blog. We put it on our WAO website. We'll also be doing video links with the speakers who are attending today, and we also have a storyfy. That means pulling together all the tweets that have been tweeted today against that particular hashtag. So, final thing for me to double check, we need to go back a couple of slides because hopefully everyone can hear me. If you can't, please can you ring on a particular number? If you ring into our main switchboard number, and the number is 02920 320 500, they can give us the message. Because we're in broadcast mode now, we can't access our messages to hear them, if that's okay. So, without further ado, let me introduce the panel to you. Anthony is on my left-hand side. May I start with you, Anthony?
Thanks, Ina. Yes, I'm Anthony Barrett. I'm Assistant Auditor General here at the Wales Audit Office, responsible for the delivery of all our financial audit work. And I suppose particularly relevant to this webinar, I'm also a certified fraud examiner, and in a previous job I was responsible for undertaking fraud investigations for one of the accountancy firms.
Thank you, Anthony. Hello, Rachel. Good morning.
Hi, I'm Rachel Tiffin. I'm head of the Counter-Fraud Centre at the Chartered Institute of Public Finance Accountancy. Counter-Fraud Centre is fairly new. We deliver tools and services to central government, local government and the third sector.
Rachel, you're very welcome. Thank you. So to my right, I have Steve. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning. I'm Steve Tooby. I'm Head of Counter-Fraud for the Welsh Government. As the title suggests, I deal with all fraud, suspected or otherwise whistleblowing allegations coming in or impacting upon Welsh Government and financing. In a previous life, I was head of the Economic Crime Unit for South Wales Police, and head of the Wales Regional Asset Recovery Team.
Steve, you're very welcome. Thank you. Last but not least, Mark, good morning and welcome.
Thank you. My name is Mark Kinsella. I work with Grant Thornton, part of their Forensic Investigation Services unit. In a previous life, I worked for the NHS and local government, looking after fraud investigations for a large internal audit consortia. I'm a qualified fraud examiner and qualified bank and accountant.
Mark, you're very welcome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So before I ask Anthony to share some opening remarks, I'd just like to say to delegates, thank you. We're receiving some questions coming in now. The panellists have yet to get a hold of them, but I'll have a look at them as soon as I possibly can, and I'll start addressing them if that's okay. Just to let you know, we've got delegates from local government, health, police, fire, central government, non-devolved bodies, and we've got some third sector organisations listening in today. So you're very, very welcome. So Anthony, when we were planning this webinar and we were talking about what topic we were going to cover in fraud, I happened to mention to you, so there's some wicked issues in fraud, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right, and I think I said the fact that actually anything in fraud is wicked, and that's not a sort of judgmental kind of comment. There is relatively an awful lot of money lost to the public sector through fraud, and given how tight resources are at the moment, I think it's important that organisations ensure that that is minimised. You're never going to eradicate it completely, and actually from a cost-effective point of view that probably isn't worth doing, to be honest. But I think it's important that organisations are alert to the risk of fraud in their organisations and take some suitable measures, ideally to prevent, but at the very least to detect, and then take some form of sanction against the perpetrators.
So I'm hearing a message of prevention coming through from your key message.
I mean, prevention is the ideal thing, type of thing, but again, it's in some respects a bit of a game. You'll put a preventative measure in, someone will find a way around it. So you constantly have to be agile and on your feet, and where prevention doesn't work, then some form of detection followed by some form of investigation and sanction and publication of that, really, or publicity around that, I think is very useful.
Okay, lovely. Thank you, Anthony. So without further ado then, I'd like to move on to the main part of the webinar. Let's look at the first question, and I'd like to start with you, Anthony, if that's okay. So the first question is, how well equipped are Welsh public bodies to effectively prevent and detect procurement fraud? What are the barriers? What barriers are there in place for organisations putting effective systems and controls in place?
Yeah, I think public sector bodies in Wales are reasonably well equipped. Most public sector organisations have some understanding somewhere in the organisation of fraud and the type of fraud risk that exists, and put in place some activities to counter that. But I think that the fact that £2.3 billion a year is lost to procurement fraud in the UK public sector shows that more could be done. And one of the things, hopefully, that we'll get out of this webinar is to increase some of that awareness and give people something to think about if they haven't already. Clearly, part of the barrier is money and resources to put into it. So there has to be some cost-benefit analysis. And certainly in my experience, public sector quite rightly has a zero tolerance to fraud. The private sector takes a more commercial view to it. There will be an acceptable level of loss, in my experience, where it would cost so much to prevent something that they're better off just taking the hit on it. And I've had some personal experiences of that with a bank many years ago. So I think in many cases there is a selling message to be done internally in an organisation around, yes, we do need to spend this money, but it's a kind of spend to save, and in most cases I would suggest you can do a quick calculation that shows, we will spend this amount of money, we will recover 2 or 3 times that amount in preventing fraud and recovering money and that sort of thing. So I think reasonably well prepared, but still more to do.
Thank you, Anthony. So you've set the scene there in terms of where you're coming from, where your Wales Audit Office hat. So let's turn to Rachel from CIPFA. What's CIPFA's view of this question?
Well, I think it's important to have a well-rounded strategy that covers all areas of counter fraud. So obviously prevention is extremely important, but also looking at detection, deterrence, investigations, and then getting the money back. Some of the measures that you can put in place don't really have to be costly, that could be preventative. So, for example, having a good whistleblowing policy in place and publicising it can mean that fraudsters might be deterred from committing fraud, knowing that someone might whistleblow on them. Some of the barriers, in my experience, have been about making the business case. As Anthony said, it's quite hard to show you know, what the benefits are, and sometimes people have difficulties in trying to say this is what prevention is going to cost and this is what we're going to get back. I also think in terms of procurement fraud that some of the types of procurement fraud are quite hard to detect and might be linked to other types of fraud also, so for example insider or corruption, and that's probably where you need to talk about using data analytics to detect the things that are harder to pick up on.
Rachel, thank you for that. Thank you. So, Steve, from a Welsh Government's perspective, what's your view on this question?
Well, I think obviously, under the present times, all public bodies are coming under financial pressure, but there's always a pressure on us as public servants, if you like, to protect the UK pound, the Welsh pound. I think we are relatively adequately set up in Wales. But as Anthony says, there is room for improvement. I think buy-in from the top is essential, and we haven't always got that to the extent that I personally would like to see it. I think training, obviously proportionality in everything we do. Fraud isn't the core business of the organisation, but in obtaining value for money and assurance, I think that's vitally important. And the point that Rachel made in relation to having a good whistleblowing panel and system, I find that most of the frauds I deal with, 80 to 90%, come through whistleblowers. So there is an opportunity for people to identify fraud, and many of them take that up. We need to take the fear out of whistleblowing and treat people appropriately under the law as well.
Steve, thank you. Before I come to Mark, I think it'd be quite appropriate for me to share with delegates that in end of October, October 29th and November the 12th, we have a whistleblowing seminar run by the Wales Audit Office. The Cardiff seminar is on the 29th of October, and the Llanrwst in North Wales event is on the 12th of November. That's in Glastir in Llanrwst. We'll send you copies of the diary markers should you be interested to register for that. So Mark, from Grant Thornton, who has both public and private sector in mind, I'm very interested to hear your take on this question.
I think some of the responses, I'll echo what's been said already, to be frank, what Anthony, Rachel and Stephen already said, in terms of good policies, good structures. And my personal view is there needs to be almost a floor-to-board review of sort of the organisational readiness to cope with fraud prevention going forward. For me, both in the commercial sector and sometimes my public sector clients, fraud is not really taken seriously. I think that's a real issue, I think, and then I don't care if you are in the private sector or public sector, you've got to take it seriously, you've got to action on it, and you have to put good preventative measures in place. And if people do fraud, then in my view, you should prosecute them. And interestingly, what I think I'm finding now in the commercial sector more and more is that the tolerance of fraud is going down and down. So in the old days, it was very much, well, we can't investigate because it's an earning per share issue or whatever. Now it's about we will not tolerate this. So I think they are seeing reputational damage much more aligned now to what we see in the public sector. There's a shift going on here, I think.
That's an interesting observation to make. Thank you for that, Mark. Thank you very much indeed. So thank you very much for your questions. So I've got a few questions coming in. In fact, we've got several questions coming in. A few of them are coming sort of in by email and on screen. So without further ado, let's deal with the first question coming in now. So how can NFI be utilised to help identify potential areas of procurement fraud? So I'll take that question and I shall ask Anthony to come up with a couple of comments, please. And then I'll come to Mark, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, NFI wasn't primarily designed to identify procurement fraud. It was largely looking at benefit fraud and other related frauds in local government. It has successfully found some cases of procurement fraud where there were unknown sort of relationships, etc., that existed between employees and suppliers. And I'm not sure that NFI, as it currently stands, would be a particularly good tool for doing that. What NFI is a very good data matching tool to do what it needs to do. I think there are probably, and other people around the table would have a probably better idea than me, other tools available or other tools that can be used to analyse data, to delve into data, to look at matches, etc., that can be used just to highlight potential risk areas or transactions that it might be worth looking at in a bit more detail. So I don't think NFI per se is the answer to this, but certainly data matching or data tools, data analytics is something that could be used.
Thank you. I have to bring Mark in on this responders because he's chomping at the bit to get in on this. Mark, can I bring you in on this one?
Yeah, I agree. I think the NFI can kind of go so far. Yeah. I think from my experience, it's where you link the NFI type checks along with some of the commercial checks you can do for things like IDEA and different products like that, for example. And what I found particularly useful recently is the use of insolvency databases to check data and match that data with that held in the public sector. And also bringing in social media for the first time. Yeah, that's a really powerful. I think you link all 3 or 4 of those systems together, then you start to see the matches and start to see how these webs can be quite large. Excuse the pun.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Anthony, do you want to come back?
I was just going to say, I think Mark's highlighted a really good point there. It's about a variety of sources of information and data, and the more that you have and start to link together, the more likely to start to find those transactions that you need to query or those relationships that need to be queried. You know, if you're just matching 2 databases, yes, you're going to find something. If you're matching 3, 4 or 5 in a very intelligent way, then that should help.
So I'm hearing a very clear message from both Mark and Anthony here in terms of the level that you're going to actually do it. If you are, do it properly or not at all. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's a couple of questions, but there's 4 questions coming in relation to about the news yesterday about the Assembly was having defrauded by over £1,000 by a dummy supplier. So I'm trying to sort of bring that, try and find one question that covers all 4 of those, slightly different angles. Can I come to you, Steve Tobin, about that question in terms of what's your view in terms of it's out there now, it's in the public. What's the next steps? Let me just get the question back on the screen. We've got slight technical issues here. Here we are, thank you. So it was in the news yesterday that the Assembly was defrauded by over 100k, by the way, by a dummy supplier. How are lessons shared across public sector to prevent suffering similar frauds in future? So that covers a couple of 4 questions in relation to that topic.
I think first and foremost, that sums it up. It's a case of due diligence, to me, is the key across every fraud, particularly procurement fraud.
Yeah.
How are lessons learned? Unfortunately, sometimes the greatest lessons learned are by the deterrent factor in the media. Okay. Publicising that we actually have got a zero tolerance. Okay. We will pursue the fraudsters, and with the buy-in from both the police, the courts, and that they're sentenced appropriately. And we've had some great successes on detecting fraud as well. As Anthony said earlier, we're never going to eradicate fraud. It's always going to be there. But if we get complacent or take our eye off the ball, and as I say, due diligence covers a lot of the preventative work, and yes, as a former police officer, prevention is far better than investigation and detection, but we need to use it as one, keep all those tools in our bag.
Thank you. Rachel, in terms of SIPS's perspective on this, what would your response be to that question?
Well, we call this particular type of fraud mandate fraud, and there are quite a lot of free tools out there that people can use to help themselves protect themselves. So the City of London Police have a web page which has free tools on it to mandate fraud. We also have a free toolkit on our website with posters and leaflets that people can customise for their own areas. I think it's really important to think about when people do get stung by this type of fraud, that the information is shared so that other people can help protect themselves. In particular, this type of fraud is always changing, And as soon as it happened, it morphed into something else, and that's continued to happen.
Yes, great. There's a couple of questions on NFI coming in. The one very specific question: is the NFI free to participants in Wales?
Yes, it is. Previously there was a charge, but under the estimate that we put forward to the Finance Committee, we made a bid for a bit of additional funding so that would be free of charge. So it is now free of charge for organisations to participate in.
Okay. So the next question we've got is, it's Anthony, this is for you. How extensively does the Wales Audit Office consider arrangements of fraud across Wales public services?
Probably limited insofar as that in terms of expressing an opinion on the accounts of an organisation, we will look to see the likelihood of material fraud. And in most cases, material actually means quite large. We could be talking millions of pounds, and the likelihood of material fraud is usually quite small. I think there is scope for organisations themselves to, and there'll be a range of techniques for doing this, to assess their susceptibility in particular areas to fraud, whether it's kind of a floor-to-board kind of review, whether it's something that we've done in the past. We've done internally, actually, in the Wales Audit Office, some fraud risk profiling, talking about where are the areas we could be weak, what are our controls in place. And actually that's very useful because you suddenly look at things a bit differently and think, actually, there might be a glaring hole there because we haven't thought about it like that. So I think it's probably less so about what the Wales Audit Office can do and more so about what organisations themselves can do to assess, with support, I have to say, to assess their own susceptibility to fraud in particular areas.
Thank you. Thank you, folks, for your questions. We've had 7 questions based around this one particular question. So I'll use this question to Steve. It's about, if I'm aware of a potential fraud or a fraudulent activity, what are my options to report it somewhere not anonymously? Now, we've had several questions along this lines. So I'm asking Steve Twyll of the Welsh Government to come back with a response on this one, please. What would their options be, Steve?
Well, there's several options. I probably won't cover them all, but referring to Welsh Government and obviously across Wales, we have a Welsh Government hotline. I don't have the number on me, but I can make that available after. We also have on the Welsh Government website where you can email that information in. You can remain anonymous on there. In Wales, we have Crime Stoppers. We have Action Fraud nationally in the UK. And you can report anonymously to the police, but my advice would be give them some lines of inquiry where they could corroborate what you're alleging.
Okay. Steve, thank you for that one. Anthony, I've got a question that comes into you again. Do the panel believe local authority investigators have the appropriate legislative powers to tackle fraud? Should regulation powers to require information from individuals be extended beyond the area of tenancy fraud? Rachel, can I ask you to come in after this on this one? If that's like, oh, that's a powerful one.
Rachel can go first if you like.
I will go first.
Thank you, Rachel.
Yes, I agree. And I think in particular, the area of procurement fraud is an area where some powers might be required. Some years ago, in a previous life, I worked on fighting fraud locally, which is the English national strategy. And one of the groups that looked at the types of fraud there, the research on that showed that there was a lack of powers in terms of procurement fraud. So, for example, you might think that something was happening with a supplier and there are difficulties in trying to obtain that information without alerting them to the fact that you're investigating them.
Okay. Anthony, anything you'd like to add to that? Because the questions are coming in thick and fast here, so I need to keep answers a bit shorter, if that's okay, folks.
Yeah, I think Rachel's answer was more helpful than mine was going to be, because I would probably have just said, in terms of, if that question's come in from somebody in a local authority, what are they being stopped from doing that they would want to do to see these frauds through and to take better action?
Okay.
And I think that's the conversation we need to have. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that there are other agencies and other organisations out there that can assist. They may not always want to because of resources, etc., but it is always worth having as we do when cases come to us, an early discussion with the police or whatever around you know, what needs to be done on this. Are we the best placed people to take it through, or do the police or another agency want to take it over?
Thank you, Anthony. Can I ask, there's a couple of delegates who've sent questions in relation to whistleblowing. We're not quite clear what you're trying to ask us. Any chance you could rephrase the question and send it in to us, please? Then there's another one that's asking a question on whistleblowing that says, there's a view that those who blow the whistle in public services often end up losing their job. What does the panel say about this? So can I come to you, Rachel, from SIPFA first, if that's okay?
I would say that if people were worried about any thing happening to them about blowing when they blow the whistle, that there is an independent charity, Public Concern at Work, you can get advice from, and you can take it from there.
Okay, thank you. Can I get Steve to come from the Welsh Government perspective on this?
Well, Rachel summed it up really in her answer, but what I will say, yes, is there has been some experience in Wales where people have appeared to be dealt with inappropriately for blowing the whistle, shall I say, and lose their jobs. There's also been employment tribunals that come out of that, so organisations need to be mindful of the fact that if they take a whistleblower on when they're giving information with good intent, because it can't be spurious information, then they should be protected, and there is legislation in place to protect them, and it will be taken seriously.
Okay, thank you for that, Steve. We've got a few poachers turned gamekeeper questions coming in here. So, Mark, is there an argument for government to employ fraudsters in order to put their very clever skills towards preventing fraud instead of conducting it? I've chosen that question, but there's several questions alluding to that topic area. I'll take one more question after this, and then we have to move on. So, Mark, what's your thoughts on that?
Clearly, it's an interesting question. I'm sure the panel may want to respond when I give my thoughts out. I have come across this, not so much in the public sector, but in the commercial sector, especially in IT fraud, where former hackers have been engaged to actually poach-turned gamekeeper. And I've got to say, it's worked. Now, you may have views about this and moral standpoints, but from a commercial perspective, the firm I was working for at the time had the view that it was better to have a good process in place to get these people rather than sit back and do nothing.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for Mark. I'm seeing Anthony's wanting to come in on that response.
I wasn't going to entirely disagree with Mark, I have to say. Right. Certainly, I have some experience through the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners where they do use fraudsters to support their research. They do use fraudsters to speak at events. Those individuals are not paid. The association refuses to pay them for that. They will pay their expenses, and there was one speaker that was due to speak at an event who wanted to arrange all his own transport and travel, etc., and wanted to get the money for that. But given his previous history, I won't say who it was, and everything else, the association said, no, that isn't how we operate. We will pay your expenses directly, you know, pay you whatever. That individual refused to attend.
Oh, right, okay.
So he clearly had some sort of ulterior motive. There is an awful lot that needs to be learned from people who carry out these frauds. And I'm familiar with the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. There will be others, but you can go onto their website and you can hear the fraudsters talk about the culture that existed within an organisation that enabled them to carry out the lack of checking, the poor auditing, the fact that when someone missed something, they were able to give an easy, glib answer to it. So there's an awful lot that can be learned from them, I have to say.
Anthony, thank you. So, folks, can I say thank you very much for all the questions. You've added some great debate to there. I'm hearing poacher term gamekeeper seems to be. I'll leave you to your thoughts on that one. So, let's move on to the next question. Question 2 is about red flags. Anthony, are there red flags that public bodies can recognise which may indicate the presence of procurement fraud in an organisation? Can I come to you on that one first, if that's okay?
Yeah, I mean, there are, with all types of fraud, there are red flags, there are warning signs, there are risk factors, whatever you want to call them. And as Rachel mentioned much earlier, you know, when you're talking about procurement fraud, there's often some form of collusion involved. some form of, whether it's internal collusion or internal and external collusion. There's something going on to circumvent some of the controls. But if you're looking at individuals, then some of the red flags would be things around: do people have, do we know that people have financial difficulties? Are people appearing to live beyond their means? They're not, obviously, one not taking holidays perhaps when they should do, and whether individuals have addiction problems. I'm not suggesting if you've got an addiction problem you're going to carry out fraud. What I'm saying is that if you've got some form of addiction, you have got something that needs to be financed, and that can often be quite expensive, and you have to sometimes find other sources of income to do that. I mean, in relation to procurement-specific issues, sometimes you can see examples of an unusually close relationship with a supplier, and that isn't always, lavish gifts or holidays or whatever. It's just kind of, I'm the only person that deals with that supplier, and they're the only ones that know me, and we want to keep that relationship. That should be a little bit of a warning. And if you're not appearing to get value for money from your contract, no one goes into a contract thinking, well, we're not going to get value for money, so we'll sign this contract. We're expecting to get value for money, and suddenly costs go up, service quality goes down, or something like that. What's wrong? Is it just a contract management issue, or is there something fraudulent taking place?
It doesn't seem to be rocket science, does it?
No, it isn't. But it is, an element of common sense and quite a healthy dose of skepticism. And to be honest, if you're talking about gut feels and things, if you think something's wrong, it probably is. You might not know exactly why, but you've got a nose for it. You can say this isn't quite right. You need to try and get under the skin of it a bit more.
Some good points kicking off this the second question here. So from CIPLA's point of view, Rachel, what would you be sharing?
I think you probably need to define what procurement fraud is to start off. So you need to decide where does it start and where does it finish. Does it start with the project that's going to lead to the procurement exercise, and does it stop with contract monitoring, or does it go beyond that? And then you need to look for the trigger points in between that. And I agree with Anthony about the red flags, the lack of holidays, the long hours, all of those things still apply. One of the things I'd say that I've come across in the past is something called revolving doors, where you have a member of staff who's involved in writing the specification, helping write the contract, working on the project, working on the tenders, and then they leave, and then a few months later they turn up working for the contractor who you've let the contract to. So it's quite important to have a revolving doors policy, I would say. The other thing I would point out is the thing about where a service is outsourced and relationships still exist with the people who were once working for your organisation, and sort of those sorts of things, gifts and hospitality, procedures and policies are quite important in those areas.
I have to come back on the revolving door policy. There's some questions already coming in about that. Is there some way you can sort of signpost for us to show, to be helpful to clarify that point?
Yeah, I can probably send over a template.
Lovely. Yes. Lovely, we'll take that. Thank you very much for that. So Steve, I'm really looking forward to your answer, because I'm sure from your previous role and in your current role, you've got some interesting stories. But starting off from the Welsh Government perspective, and I'd love to hear a couple of stories if we've got time.
Well, I'm going to try and turn this on its head a little bit. Red flags you can look up in fraud books on the internet, and you'll get pages and pages of them. And they're all there. So many that sometimes we can get complacent towards them and not look at them. But when I say I'm going to turn it on its head, the previous question, one of the questions that came in, mentioned about speaking to fraudsters. I look at any fraud, particularly through procurement fraud, as much as I can through the eyes of a fraudster. I've interviewed many of them, I've convicted many, but I've also gone to speak to them in prison after conviction. And listen to what they say. Some of them are opportunistic, some of them are more organised, and will test your systems out. They may even do a dummy run to test your procurement systems to see how they work, because they won't identify a weakness unless they've got an insider without doing that. So the more calculated ones will test you. They will see how complacent you are. They will try and befriend you. And many of the good fraudsters, I say good, they're all bad really, that I've spoken to have normally got some sort of personality and some ruse that win you over. And even when interviewing them, sometimes they can really be believable. It's only when you establish the facts that you realise they were actually, to coin a phrase, having one over on you. I think Internally, you've got your processes, you can look at your procedures, your policies in place. Externally, without Mark glaring at me, I think private sector are there to make money, and you must never lose sight of that. Tough times can call for tough measures sometimes. I'm a former police officer. My level of trust isn't perhaps the level of other people. I wouldn't put my name to something unless it was totally accurate, and that's what I mean about complacency. Due diligence is paramount in every area of procurement fraud. It doesn't stop. The more you sort of find out, whether it's on open source information, whether it's through an embellished CV or contract on what they can provide, it all raises the level of risk and how deep you should or have to look at them. For me, it's much more difficult to identify the red flags and say fraud is occurring at the initial application stage, the contract stage. Not impossible, but it's more difficult. It's when they come to claim the money. That's when they show their hand. That's where the weaknesses is. And to any fraud investigator, certainly police officers, that's where they will look if things go wrong. But often, as we spoke, prevention's better than cure. So if you get all your other processes right, if you look at the identified red flags, if you can be mindful of the fact that you need to be vigilant, not complacent looking at those. When you get to the claims area, people will embellish. They will use non-eligible spends on their contracts, and sometimes there'll be a fictitious company, as the example we heard with the assembly, or fictitious invoices. As a bit of my own due diligence, I tend to send out on occasions to some of the suppliers to see if that invoice is legitimate, and I get about a 75% return.
Wow.
So
wow.
That's an easy, cheap
That's a
way.
good tip. That's a very good. Would you like to repeat that tip just once again, Steve, just in case people didn't catch that, because that's a simple but good tip.
Well, where contractors, service providers are providing, it's normally on the larger contracts or even grants within Welsh Government. If there's a long list of invoices coming in of various different companies, and I've done it with the police as well, if you send out a pro forma questionnaire saying, did you supply this invoice, did you provide this service or product to this company, you'll have a 75%, well, I have a 75% return at the moment, and in some cases, every invoice has been fictitious.
Right, okay, thank you. Powerful words there, thank you, Steve. So, Mark, you're taking up the mantle of the private sector again. What have you got to say on this question?
I think the points have been made by all three speakers. I think are very valid. I think one of the interesting things to me is I saw some interesting data only recently, which talked about a 47% increase in supply chain fraud in the last year in the commercial sector. It's a massive issue. Clearly, it's an issue for the commercial sector, it's an issue for the public sector. I think one of the things which we are doing is, it's interesting what's been said on a number of levels here, is that I've been developing almost like a fraud detection type of looking at key controls, and rather than doing like an audit, go in and say, this is where you're exposed, this is where you've got to put right. If you don't do this, you will lose X, and we monetize that. Mm. That's been quite a powerful argument for the commercial sector. Mm-hmm. I don't know whether it'll work in the public sector, but I think what he's trying to do is saying, this will cost you X if you don't do this at some time in the future. Yeah. If you invest now in prevention, which is where my heart is, along with the rest of the panel, we can save this going forward. That improves underlying profitability for private, which is great, tick in the box. But at the same time, I think we could use that sort of type of approach possibly in the public sector. I'm not quite sure what people think of that one, but it's an interesting observation.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Well, I've got a question coming straight back at you, Mark. Thank you very much, folks, for your questions. Please keep them coming in. Can I just say, we're having a fantastic volume of questions. I'll try and manage your expectations here. We may not address every question live, but I can assure you on behalf of the panel, we will get them addressed after the event and share it back via the Good Practice Exchange blog. So rest assured, if it's not answered today, we will answer it. But we have a couple of questions about cashless societies to Mark. So the question is, would moving to a cashless society increase or reduce the potential for fraud?
I think fraudsters just adapt to the environment they're presented with. I don't think it'd be better or not. I just think they would. You look at the cashless car payments in London. We know we're increasing the level of like £80 soon, £50 soon. We know already that there's fraud there. I just think the forces will adapt. They're good at it, and we're always playing catch up. To be frank, that's my personal opinion.
Thank you very much. Thanks for that, Anthony. I'd like to bring you in on a question which says we're a new organisation and are in the mix of developing a fraud prevention and detection strategy. What resources or groups are available to share best practice hints and tips? And can I come to you, Rachel, second on that one, if that's okay?
Yeah, I mean, there will obviously be information available on WAO Good Practice Exchange. There'll be information available from Rachel and her team and other organisations around all the websites. If that organisation is one that's in Wales, for example, there's also the Wales Fraud Forum, which if you Google that, you can find that, which holds an annual conference, but also has local seminars, etc., on particular fraud-related topics. That question's in relation to developing a fraud prevention detection strategy. That probably means, I don't know whether that means talking about producing a document or actually having a culture. Producing the document's the easy thing. Actually disseminating that, getting people to understand it, understanding the culture that's involved, what isn't acceptable behaviour, whether it's fraudulent or not, that sort of thing. That's more difficult to do, but as a new organisation, I think you have perhaps a better opportunity of developing the culture you want from an anti-fraud point of view, that one that's had its culture developed over a number of years and needs to change it perhaps.
Anthony, thank you. Once you mentioned culture, Rachel wanted to come in on that point there. Did you want to expand on that from a CIPFA perspective?
No, well, only really that culture seems to be the thing that underpins the whole strategy. Mm-hmm. So whatever you decide to do in terms of, I talked about having a comprehensive strategy, it's important to have that culture thing sitting all the way through, because it's about the tone from the top where it needs to sit in the strategy. And if the strategy is not agreed at the top, it's never really going to go anywhere.
Okay. Rachel, just to say that a couple of people have mentioned availability of the free tools they used. We will ensure that everything, all the resources people talk about, the links will be made available to you. So I'd like to move on to Steve now. A couple of people are wanting to know what are the main areas of fraud suffered by public services today?
Well, predominantly I'll answer that in relation to Wales. Obviously, procurement and services, highly topical within local authorities, and benefit frauds. But I mean, Rachel may be able to answer that a little bit more thoroughly than me, because I know she's had a big input in fighting fraud locally to publicise a really good document. The Welsh Government, we're slightly different because I'm not saying we don't suffer procurement fraud. I think every public organisation does. But we're a large provider of grants and funding, obviously to try and boost the economy of Wales. So there's an inherent risk there. So a lot of my work relates around grant fraud. So it depends what area of the public sector you're in, but it's right across the board. Anthony mentioned earlier, there's groups like Welsh Fraud Forum, stuff like that. I actually sit on the Welsh Fraud Forum. I also sit on an intelligence gathering network with all law enforcement agencies within Wales. They're based all across the UK. I think there's 8 regions. They're called GAIN groups, which are intelligent networks. Yeah. And all areas of law enforcement come together there, and we do share information legally.
Thank you. And we'll make sure that information in relation to GAIN group is actually shared following the event, if that's okay. Mark, there's a question just come in from the panel. It says, does the panel have a view on the prevalence of substitution fraud? Do you have answers? And then second part of it comes through to you, Steve. How is Welsh Government helping organisations create an anti-fraud culture? What should we be doing? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. You're the first one that have the heads up on any question, and I'll come back to you then about that.
I was just going to ask, in terms, I'm probably showing my ignorance here, is exactly what's meant by substitution fraud. Because, so if the individual who asked about the prevalence of substitution fraud is able just to give an example, because we might be thinking about different things.
Right. To seek clarity there, because that delegate send another question back in just to clarify that. In the meantime, I'll come to Steve from Welsh Government to that question. How is Welsh Government helping organisations create an anti-fraud culture? What should we be doing?
We should be talking to each other. One of the biggest failings in any anti-fraud policy is the lack of data sharing. Law restricts us to a point, but even under data protection, if you read Section 29 of the Data Protection Act, it allows us to prevent criminality, not just fraud, through that, and it actually mentions finance and public sector bodies within Section 29. Not a lot of people know that. Other advice is to set up hotlines, again, like we've mentioned earlier, reporting frauds, whistleblowing, protecting anonymity, easy for me to say. And within Welsh Government, we also have what we call a good governance group, where we share not only people trying to target organisations, but best practice as well that has worked in a number of organisations. They're mainly sponsored bodies of the Welsh Government, but they include the Charity Commission as well. Okay. So it's sharing that data and pushing the boundaries to see what you can do. I got a phrase through financial investigations called being legally audacious. The fraudster will actually push the boundaries. We should be legally audacious as well.
I love that expression. I think we ought to tweet that one out, actually. I'm thinking that's going to be the buzzword for the morning. Anthony, you're wanting to come back on...
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think, you know, hotlines, and most organisations should have them, are a very important tool. I remember I was involved back in the well, when it had been back in the mid-1990s, setting up a hotline in a local government body. And it kind of went in waves. You publicised the hotline and you got calls, and then it would go quiet, and then you'd have to republicise it. You'd have to keep awareness of it. And even sometimes the calls we got through on those hotlines, they didn't, the specific issue the individual was calling about was not a fraudulent issue. But in looking at it, we identified something else that was.
Yeah.
You know, so the fact that we were looking at it, it just highlighted something else. And I think if you've got a hotline, then you have to manage it properly. You have to make sure you have the resources to take some action on the calls, to try and publicise it, to feedback where you can. Then that helps to raise the whole profile of everything.
Anthony, thank you. Everyone's nodding on the table about sort of managing the hotline properly and make sure it's resourced. Mark, I'm going to come to a question with you wearing your hat. So you're based in Grant Thornton in London, and sort of a number of your public sector clients have already gone through major reorganisation. So thinking of the potential reorganisation that's going to happen in local government in Wales, does the experience indicate higher levels of fraud in larger organisations?
Yes.
Fair response. Fair response.
I think it's an important issue to face now, because in my experience with the, so I get a bit controversial, in some respects, decimation of the fraud type support services in England. I was in a session recently with a Midlands group, and some of the guys talked about there they've lost 60% of their fraud investigators. Yet they're doing more work in bigger authorities. It is madness. My message would be to take this seriously now and put in your fraud prevention people now before we get bigger. That's my view.
Thank you for that, Mark. Anthony, you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to say that I would expect that to be the case. I wouldn't lose sight of what can happen in very small organisations where there is a significant amount of trust in one or two individuals, where that trust then gets abused. We've seen North Wales a few years ago with some small community councils where the clerk defrauded, stole, I think it was about £64,000 or whatever from those, largely because a significant amount of trust was placed in that one individual. So we might not be talking hundreds and hundreds of thousands of pounds, but actually, for small community councils in Wales, 64,000 is a lot of money that's been lost to that community.
Okay, Anthony, thank you. I'd like to move on now to the third question. So the third question is, how can public bodies employ data analytics to prevent and detect procurement fraud? Anthony, can I start with you?
Yeah, I've already sort of mentioned NFI as a good data matching tool for what it does, and it's been very effective. Started back in '96, £26 million of fraud and overpayment identified in Wales, 1.17 billion across the UK. But that's good for what it is, and I think there must be vast amounts of data out there relating to procurement and contracting that I'm sure could be used in some way to make the task of identifying suspect or fraudulent transactions much easier.
Okay, thank you, Anthony. Rachel?
Yes, I think using data analytics is the way forward, really, and to link that with collaboration. So it's important to use it across your organisation and across other organisations.
Mm-hmm.
I would say NFI is very good, only goes so far. You need to be innovative about the other things that you put in there, as Mark talked earlier.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that, Rachel. Thank you. Steve, would you like to add to Rachel's comments?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on data analytics. I know Mark's certainly got far more knowledge of that area than me, but it is the way forward. It's the retaining that data, and I'll mention something now that is impacting upon me in a number of frauds. It's the retaining of that data for disclosure when you're actually pursuing a prosecution. It's crucial. The CPS have spoken to me recently on a number of cases on how we must retain that information as well. So data analytics are certainly the way forward. And I think, within Wales here, we've got, in 2013 we set up the National Procurement Service. I'd like to see that expand, where we're going through one agency and we're actually checking on a number of suppliers for a number of public organisations, really. It breaks down barriers, legal barriers, where you can't share information so easily.
Okay. Important comment there. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to hearing Mark's comments, because this is your area of expertise. It's your bag, isn't it, Mark?
This is my passion, I'm afraid, and the last time I was asked to speak in this, I spent 5 hours. Don't worry. For me, this is the one tool we could use which the fraudsters are frightened of, in my view. I think it needs to be part of a much wider fraud barrier management system. It needs to be part of a whole system approach. I think, in my view, is we need to link. You have excellent information systems in the public sector, the NFI and the NFI applicator. We can do in that respect. But my view is it's about how we can combine that with systems in the private sector. I'll give you an example. I was doing a piece of work for a commercial client only recently. They had an issue about VAT numbers. I applied the data analytics tool I use. I checked 170,000 VAT numbers in less than 4 seconds.
Wow.
As simple as that. I think it's about embedding these systems, linked into public sector systems, linked into social media systems, linked into about 175 databases which are available on the net, which you can tie into, and you can then check people's addresses, PO box numbers, so they own the property, all in one go. It's possible. I'm doing it for a 1.5 billion pound organisation currently, and we have 3 weeks to look at all their systems, both for efficiency and also in terms of their fraud exposure. Now, I think it can be done. Yeah. You just need to think differently, think laterally. I think if we can link it with the extra systems you have in the public sector, I think it's a very powerful tool we should all use. That's my personal view.
So you're not believing in reinventing the wheel yet. The information and the process is already there.
Just using systems which are quite reasonable, not expensive systems to use, to be frank. And many of the commercial firms, I'm sure, many of the public sector get this information. You have scripts already written which you can just test for fraud. We can test the algorithms. We can use benefit analysis. It's all there.
Okay.
Just use it.
Just use the data.
That's what I'm saying. Just use it and link it to what you have in NFI. I think it's a real powerful message, really.
Okay.
That's why I can't access that information. You could.
Okay.
The other way. That's the real powerful argument I would tend to suggest.
So that's your standpoint of connecting NFI to this data system?
Yeah. For example, there are some fantastic insolvency databases out there.
Yeah.
They're not expensive. But if you can link all of that with 10 years records of people you're dealing with, say suppliers or directors, you can just check on these systems. £5,000, not expensive from my perspective. And suddenly you have access to all the information.
Okay.
Which you can link into what you have in your NFI. That would be my sort of suggestion.
Mark, thank you for that. Can I say to the delegates, thank you very much for all these questions coming, so much appreciated. And to the delegate who sent clarity back on the substitution question, I'll come back to that one in a minute if I may. I want to pick up on a couple of things about the questions coming about grants. There appears to be a higher level of fraud associated with grant-funded work as compared with work routed through established public services. Does this point to the Welsh Government needing to rethink the role of grants versus co-funding? Right, none of the panels have cited this question until right now, so I'm looking to Anthony and Steve to take responses to that, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether there are high levels of fraud associated with grant funding. I think there's Wales does use a lot more grants than England does, and there might be an issue about whether that's the most effective way of providing that funding. But equally, I recognise that the grant funding is targeted at specific things, and that the government wants to have an impact on. I think one of the things that we've picked up from today is that you need to look at the fraud in totality across your organisation and not just focus on one particular area. Grants might be a particular risk area in an organisation, and there should be some focus on that, but you can't afford to neglect all the other things that are happening.
Thank you very much. Steve, can I come to get a response from the Welsh Government perspective on this?
Well, to use the Welsh Government as an example, and to local authorities, the Welsh Government give out, I'm not going to say it in this, but a substantial amount of money in grants. So as a former police officer, we're bound to be the target of fraudsters and some of the bigger fraudsters to try and get at that grant money. That doesn't mean to say it doesn't happen in local authorities, because it does. In Wales, we have a different system than they do to England and Scotland. Okay. Personally, I believe the Welsh system is better. Why do I think that? I've lectured to the other 4 nations. I presented to the other, I probably have lectured. But I've presented to the 4 other nations' ERDF teams on what we do in Wales here, and they appear to be quite impressed with it. I know in Scotland a lot of their grant money goes out to the local authorities in the form of core funding. To me, you lose control. Simple as that.
Okay. Thank you, Steve. So coming back to that question about substitution, so substituting horse meat instead of beef, substituting one product for another, presenting it as another, goat for lamb, etc. Does the panel have a view? Is that fraud?
Yeah, I mean, it is fraud. That you are being deceived about what you're getting. You are probably paying for one thing and being provided with something cheaper. Okay. So that there's a cost as well. And I think the example goes on to talk about buying a week's work and getting 5 minutes work. More and more, it's not about buying time, it's about buying a service, buying an output, buying a quality output. And if you assess that quality output takes a day to deliver, and someone actually delivers it in half a day, the same output, you probably got your specification a bit wrong, or the organisation was super efficient, etc. That may not be fraud, but it's again, you need to have monitoring systems, whether it's for particular types of meat, whether it's for the quality of service you're getting under a contract or whatever, to be able to say, actually, we're not getting the quality that was set out in the contract, and is that just sort of contract management issue, or is there something else underlying it that means, well, actually, that the bid or the price was fraudulent?
Okay, Anthony, thank you. Mark, there's a couple of questions come in for you in relation to data analytics. One of the questions is rating, could data analytics techniques be used to identify when items are being procured using non-authorised public sector procurement systems?
It all depends upon how the flag is set up and what data you're harvesting.
Okay.
At the end of the day, data analytics and the data you harvest and look at is only as good as what you collect.
Okay.
That's the issue, really. In terms of non-authorised public sector procurement systems, now certainly in my experience, clearly if you're buying through a framework agreement, it will be an authorised procurement system. Okay. If you're buying offline or off procurement, then that would need to be identified.
Okay.
And in the body, that should be subject to audit. That should be subject to governance process in the organisation who've agreed to go offline to do it.
Okay.
So there are mitigating controls that should be in place to pick it up.
Thank you for that. There's another question I'd like to come back to on benchmarking. One of the questions says, analytics are powerful, terrific at identifying variations from the benchmark. Who provides the benchmark?
That's an interesting question, actually. It's I started using analytics back in the early noughties for non-fraud type work, actually, to be frank. The benchmarks, the ones you develop on analytics, you develop your approach, you develop the benchmark as you develop what you're looking for, in a way. That's my view, and it's different from my view about this. But so in the commercial sector, you're writing different scripts the whole time to respond to different flaws, for example. Yeah. Oh, so if you stick with what you got in your standard, there's a chance you can miss something.
Yeah. Okay.
So there's a developmental tool, really.
Fair comment. Fair comment. Rachel, from a sister perspective regarding benchmarking.
Well, maybe not from a sector perspective, from personal experience. I think probably you set the benchmark, because the benchmark is deviating from the norm, and the norm might be your organisation's contract procedure rules. So you only do these things up to you get 2 quotes up to a certain level, you let a contract after a certain amount of money. So it's about what's reasonable and what patterns might show that you've deviated from that particular thing. And Mark talked about suppliers. One of the ways that you can look at things is if you've got one-time vendors. When you've got a framework agreement and suddenly you start letting contracts to someone as a one-time vendor.
Yeah.
And if you can link that with looking at your credit system, see when the vendor file was set up, and after when it's been deactivated, you start to make it much bigger. Link it to your payroll system, see whether what staff are involved possibly. That's what you do it.
Just simple, isn't it? It's not rocket science. Okay. I'd like to move on to question 4, if that's all right. I know we've touched quite a lot on question 4 on culture, but let's see if we can take it to another level, shall we? So, Anthony, what role does organisational culture play in preventing and detecting procurement fraud? How do public bodies establish a whole organisation zero tolerance approach to fraud? It's something that's been sort of underlying for all our question, isn't it?
And I think, from the conversations we've been having, it's absolutely essential. And certainly, if you can look at other countries or states around the world where bribery and corruption either is or has largely been regarded as a way of life, and it's kind of endemic at every level of society. Now the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the USA and the Bribery Act in the UK have begun to challenge that, so that organisations doing business abroad now have to operate in a much more ethical way. So that's if you like some external pressure being applied. It's interesting if you look at some of the research that our own personal values and beliefs only rank 3rd in us deciding what is appropriate behaviour in the workplace. The first thing we look at is how our boss behaves to decide what is appropriate behaviour in the workplace. So as Rachel and Mark and Steve have said, the tone at the top is vital. And I certainly have, and we may all have seen examples in organisations where more junior people are prosecuted to the hilt and sacked, etc. And more senior people the perception is they kind of get out of it somehow, or they're allowed to leave quietly or something like that. That sets the tone, which is if you're a senior person, you can get away with this, and if you're junior, you're not. Clearly, the correct answer is that everyone should be treated exactly the same, and the bad guys and girls should not be tolerated. But you have to have the right sort of culture, and people have to be able to demonstrate it and live those values. I've worked in the private sector, albeit on public sector contracts where there was no gifts and hospitality between us, and my colleague who was working on private sector contracts was getting boxes at football and all sorts of things. Just the way it is. I'd have liked to have gone to a box at the football, but that wasn't part of my own personal belief set in terms of the work that's being done. And I think it's very important that organisations set out their values and beliefs, not just in relation to fraud, but in relation to everything they do, but specifically in relation to fraud, have a zero tolerance of fraud, and demonstrate that zero tolerance in what they do.
Tone and from the top is the expression of the day there, isn't there?
Yes.
So Rachel, culture.
Okay. Everything starts with me defining things, so I think
Not a bad place. Not a bad place to start, is it?
Yeah, I think you need to define what a zero tolerance approach means, and whether you really have the appetite for it. Because nothing's worse than saying we're going to do something about it and then not. And I'm not being controversial, but I've seen organisations make the statement and then not do anything about frauds afterwards. So really you need to decide, is zero tolerance, does it mean that you're going to look at every case, or that fraud is completely unacceptable, or that you'll take action on every case? And it needs to be an organisation-wide thing. We talked a bit earlier about dummy suppliers and mandate fraud. Well, the people that take those calls that say, please change my bank account details, they're not fraud officers, they're practitioners. So they're the people that you need to have on board and on side working with you. The other thing I would say is that hopefully everyone's read the new UK anti-corruption plan, which talks about bribery and corruption and the plans that people should be putting in place about preventing fraud and corruption, which obviously is closely linked to procurement fraud.
We'll ensure that that document that Rachel just referred to is added onto our resource list. So, given what Rachel just said about setting the tone and sort of the definition of fraud and fraud tolerance, where does Welsh Government sit on this, Steve?
We've high aims. I mean, I've been in place in Welsh Government just over 5 years now. And before I was in post, there was no head of counter fraud. So we had some tough learning curves. We've come a long way from the top of the organisation, zero tolerance. We've a separate fraud and corruption risk assessments, and I think it's important to add that word corruption, because I tend to use it as a bit of a stick, because under the Bribery Act there's now for the first time ever a corporate offence, I think it's section 7, where you allow bribery to occur. And that gives you 6 principles of mitigation to avoid it. Now I use those 6 principles to actually enforce, if you like, for want of a better word, my fraud risk assessment, to get the buy-in from the managers within those policy areas. And they're not rocket science. It mentions from the top awareness raising, risk assessments, communication training, and monitoring.
See, that's really helpful. Thank you very much. Mark, so from the private and public sector hat, where do you stand on the cultural issue?
I think it's absolutely pivotal. I think it boils down to, any fraud strategy has to be developed, I think, from board to floor. Staff have to be engaged in that process. They have to believe that if there is an issue and you whistleblow, that you'll get their support. You'll support them. I think that's really important. On the commercial, it's quite interesting the debate today about what about the commercial sector? Is it different from the public sector?
Yeah.
Not always. And I'm doing a piece of work currently in Eastern Europe, where the company absolutely clear they want us to review their systems for UK Bribery Act and compliance with the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act 1977. So they're really getting their act together, saying we will not tolerate this. So I think things are moving. Not all companies, but things are moving. Okay. And I think also, one of the things I say a lot to people, is that the private sector can learn a lot from the public sector. Okay. That's always been my mantra, and I think we should think more on those lines going forward, and vice versa.
Mark, thank you.
That's all right.
Got some great questions coming in here now. Should the Welsh Government encourage the development of champions in detection of fraud across each area, for example, procurement, payroll, etc.? Also, should there be a minimum skill set standard set? NHS fraud investigators must be accredited, but not sure if this is the same across all public sector organisations. So, Anthony, can I get you to come in on this one first, if that's okay?
Yeah, I think if you are talking, if you make one of the points that Rachel made about the people taking the calls from the suppliers to change the details, they need to have a sufficient awareness of the sorts of things that could be happening, but they're not the people you're going to be expecting to be investigating fraud. You do need to have the skills and the training, etc., and build up some experience to be able to conduct these investigations, particularly as ultimately some of these investigations may end up in a criminal court, and you need to have followed the due process right from the moment you started it off. Any point along the way where we tend to operate, when we get a call about something, we look at it and kind of think, where's this going to take us? Is it going to take it to a public interest report, or is it we're going to end up in court giving evidence, in which case it needs to be dealt with in a particular way. So you do need specific skills, etc. And those skills need to be kept up to date and refreshed. I don't do any of the type of fraud investigation I used to do sort of 10, 15 years ago, but I kind of make sure I try and keep up to date with what's happening. So I would still be able to. We've got the NHS counter fraud specialists. We've got other specialists in other parts. We don't necessarily have the same across all parts of the public sector. I'm not sure personally there's a strong need for the same, but people need to be trained and have skills. And there are undoubtedly probably some pockets where they're not using trained or perhaps sufficiently skilled staff, and therefore maybe missing things or not getting things right.
Okay, Anthony, thank you. I'd just like to say to all delegates, but there is a question that I'm going to be asking you specifically, and it's the final question. So I'll give you a couple of minutes heads up on this in order to get you thinking hats on. My question to you is, what support do you need and want in terms of trying to help public bodies fight against procurement fraud? I'd love to see your sort of responses in on this, rather than sort of that question is directed at you, and we'd like to hear what you've got to say, because that'll help shape and to direct some of our next stages of where we need to go to. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go around the table finally and ask all the panel members to share their sort of one thought they'd like delegates to take away from what they've heard this morning. It may not actually be something they've said, it might be something one of the other panel members have said, or one of the questions that they've actually heard. So just to repeat that question to delegates, we'd like to hear from you. What kind of support would you like and need in terms of enabling public services to fight fraud together? Because that is the key pivotal purpose of this today, fighting fraud together, procurement fraud together as across public services, not a single sector. So, Anthony, what's the message you'd love delegates to take away from what you've heard, from either from questions, from yourself, or from other panel members here today?
Yeah, I probably won't take the obvious one, or perhaps the one that was most prevalent in the discussion, which was agriculture. But probably what I was going to say was understand, in your own organisations, understanding what your fraud risks are, where you are most at risk as an organisation, and then understanding that you've got some measures in place to counteract those. And given the relatively large number of people we've had participating today, talk to your colleagues, talk to people in other organisations, other authorities. Use the Wales Fraud Forum, use other facilities available to talk to each other about the particular risks you might be facing and how other organisations have dealt with it.
Thank you, Anthony. Thanks very much. Rachel?
Okay, I think really it's about knowing and acknowledging your risks. Use the available best practice that's out there, data analytics tools, share and collaborate, and take action and publicise that you take action.
That's been a key message about publicising as well, isn't it? Rachel, thank you. Steve, can I come to you from Welsh Government? Thank you.
I'm going to say it again. Be legally audacious. Know your powers. Yeah, you can receive fraud training. In my experience, whilst in the police, I received financial investigative training. But unless you've got someone to explore the boundaries of that with you, a mentor, a shadow, and that's what you need for fraud as well. I've had personnel within Welsh Government, particularly from our European funding office, shadowing me. And it helps to raise awareness. It also gives them an interest in fraud. I've run fraud courses with the help of CIPFA within Welsh Government, thanks to Rachel, and we'll no doubt run more. You just can't do enough, because the fraudster, and particularly the organised fraudster out there, will be targeting you and will certainly be targeting Welsh Government.
Okay. Steve, thank you. Mark, finally, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, a lot's been said before while I was with us, so I obviously echo all that. I think for me it's about really starting to think laterally. almost like thinking, how are they going to defraud us? I think from that perspective, I think you made a point over about doing that. I think it's about, I do think it's about data analytics going forward. I think it's about linking those with the NFI, with the commercial databases. That's a real powerful tool. I think the last thing I just want to kind of get across to people is, and this is based upon my own research going back about too many years, about 15 years, is that in my experience, it's prevention is about 7 times more cost effective than investigation. So put your systems in place, make good systems in place, get the support of the organisation, get some good governance in place, and you will make it hard for them. You won't prevent it, at the very beginning, but you'll make it more harder for them.
Great message to be leaving with us on that, Mark. Thank you very much. So your messages are coming through thick and fast. Thank you very much. It's great seeing all these messages. We're really, really grateful for all your messages. So it's easy for me to leave a couple of messages with you in terms of what's going to happen next. All your questions, anonymously, will be shared with you as delegates, so you can see what kind of questions people are asking. Some of them will have been answered directly by the panel today, live on this webinar. I'm going to show you that over the next sort of months that all the panel members will have responded to all the questions in full, and we'll share that with you via Good Practice blog. So what's going to happen next? As I said earlier, this webinar is being recorded. We're going to spend a few days editing it down into 4 sections, so you can just listen to responses from one question, or you can at a time, so you can listen to it that way. We'll also be ensuring that when we put the podcast on, if you wanted to hear what maybe Rachel has said or Steve has said to that particular response, there's a time on there. You can click on a link and you can go straight to that panel member. All the resources that have been mentioned by all panel members will be shared, and we'll put it on our website to you, and we'll also email it back to you. And everyone who's tweeted will pull that back together. It just leaves me to say thank you very much to all panel members this morning, and to you delegates, because you've made this webinar as interactive as possible through all the questions that you've asked. So diolch yn fawr ar rhan Swyddfa Chwilio Cymru. Thank you very much on behalf of the Wales Audit Office. I'd like to sign off. This is Dina Lloyd on behalf of the Good Practice team of the Wales Audit Office.